All right. Well, welcome. It's good to have you with us. My name is Fraser Catton, and I want to welcome you to our session 2 of Removing the Barriers to Belief. We've also got with us Nathan Tasker. Nathan's in the middle. And Sven Östring.
Good to be here, Fraser.
Excellent. Hey, what I thought we might do, folks, while people are just joining us and coming on in, we might do a bit of a recap of what we looked at last session. So this is session 2. Previous session, we looked at 2 pretty big questions. First one was, does God exist? And the second question was, and this is, so does God exist? Sven looked at that one. And then Nathan Tasker looked at our second question and that was, if God exists, why is there so much evil and suffering? So it was, great question. What we might do is just, Sven, do you want to give us a 1-minute recap of what you looked at last session?
Yes, so the question, does God exist? We looked at 5 different lines of evidence, 5 lines of reasoning for God, that God exists. First, that God is the cause of the universe. The universe began to exist, and he was the person, the being that brought the universe into existence. Secondly, the universe is finely tuned for intelligent life, like you and I. And so that God is the reason, he's the intelligent designer behind the fine tuning of the universe. We also dived down into your cells and checked out your DNA. And we recognize information is there, and we recognize that information comes from an intelligent mind, and that God is the ultimate source for that information, the genetic alphabet, the genetic code as well, and the information. And then we looked at morality. So this was leading into Nathan's talk. We saw if we want to be able to identify evil as really being evil, we need objective moral values. And the only way we can do that if God is the foundation for those objective moral values. And finally, we looked at the resurrection of Jesus, and we did a quick kind of summary. And if Jesus rose from the dead, then God exists. So those were the 5 lines of reasoning for does God exist?
Wow, yeah, managed to do a great job of covering a fair bit in 20 minutes, Sven. And folks, if you're struggling to keep up, that's okay. We are going to have a bit of a summary sheet of this put together. So if you've registered for the webinar, in the next week, we'll shoot that through to you so you've got kind of the condensed version. Nathan, can you give us a quick recap of what you looked at in your talk about suffering and evil? Oh, we haven't got your audio, Nath. So while you're sorting that out, we're just going to welcome a few people. Wayne, good to have you back with us again. And folks, this has been an interactive webinar. So if you are if you're comfortable, jump on the chat and you can comment and add your thoughts. How this is going to work is we have a short presentation, about 15-20 minutes, and then we're going to have some Q&A. And g'day Priscilla, Darius and Elizabeth, good to have you guys with us. Presentation followed by some Q&A, and the Q&A is where you get to ask the questions that you want to ask. So the real purpose for this was so that you could jump on and say, hey, look, yeah, I've always wondered about this. Can you help me answer this question, or can you help explain how I would explain this to somebody else if you already have a Christian worldview? And perhaps if you don't have a Christian worldview, then it's an opportunity for you to explore where these guys are, where we're coming from, and kind of dig a little bit deeper into their topic.
Are we back now?
So you are back, Nathan. Good to have you with us.
Sorry, I'm really sorry I don't know what happened there, but I had an eye moment. So there you go.
That's all right. You're back. Good to have Carmela joining us from Canada.
Oh, cool. Hello, Carmela.
And Graham as well. So, Nathan, you're just going to give us a little recap of last night's session on suffering and evil.
So I have some dear friends who have had a really good conversation with me, sort of wondering, if you believe in this all-powerful, loving God, how could it be that he or she or it or whatever they are would allow terrible things to happen? Maybe your God doesn't exist, or maybe this God is powerless or doesn't care. And that's a fairly common objection that does tend to show itself quite a lot. So I had a story last night about Air Florida Flight 90, a fairly famous accident in 1982 that flew into a bridge and ended up in some icy water with 6 survivors. Essentially, if we don't have a God that exists, then it's really hard to figure out what evil actually is. We can say, I don't like what's happening. I don't like that someone stole my car. But it's really hard to be very objective and universal in saying it's wrong for you to steal my car. We looked at 4 alternative options. If there is no God, there could be 4 alternative authority sources, if you like, to a God figure. And those 4 could be maybe the government or the legislature, the ruling body, the council, the chiefs or the ruling elders, your social authority figure, whatever society you come from. But they aren't always perfect. They do make mistakes. You might find that they do things that are not always moral. So you can't always trust that particular group of people as good as they can be.
Hang on, you're talking about we can't trust politicians? Is that?
Well, I don't want to put a broad brushstroke there. There could be some good ones, but we certainly don't want to trust every single body with a blank slate, because
absolutely.
There are questionable politicians out there. Let's just put it that way. In addition to politicians, we also have the possibility of a democratic process, as one of my dear colleagues has suggested. Hey, we've got democracy on our side. We're not like some sort of, communist regime or some dictator. We've elected our leaders democratically, and the voice of the majority has spoken. Well, unfortunately, as we've discussed last night, sometimes majorities can also be tyrannical and morally imperfect. And one example was the Salem witch hunt. I don't think we would agree with, well, at least I don't agree with the Salem witch hunt, even though the majority at the time felt it was the right thing to do. So you can't always go with the majority. Which brings us back to the survival of the fittest. Might makes right. The big baseball bat wins the argument. But what if the big baseball bat wielding person's a meanie? What if he's a psychopath? Then what? So you're sort of stuck with maybe the 4th option is yourself or myself. I think it's right. But if I think it's right and you think differently, we still have to resolve that somehow. So what I'm saying is, if there's no objective moral agent who says, I'm going to trump everybody else, I'm going to say this is right and this is wrong. If you don't have that, we're going to fight unendingly. We'll agree sometimes. We'll agree that it's wrong to steal a car, but we might disagree on another topic. And I'm just saying, without God, there's no objective morality. And we went through what it takes to identify a hero in a crisis. And we looked at the fact that an ultimate hero isn't just one who jumps in as a show pony, but the ultimate hero is one who might actually invest himself or herself in that emergency, in that terrible situation, perhaps even pay the ultimate price for a friend, or perhaps even a stranger, which is even more amazing still. We also looked at the possibility that when there's a problem of evil, the believer and the non-believer both agree it should be fixed. The disagreement is when, the problem of time. And we looked last night at some explanations that might give reason for time to be a requirement, even though we're all impatient for the problem to be solved. So happy to take questions, but that's a brief nutshell.
Yeah, that's good. I'm going to post in the chat, folks, just the YouTube video from last night, so you can watch the presentation when you want. But, Nathan, you talked about this picture of a hero and what a hero looks like and the qualities of a hero. And, we all look for heroes in our lives. We all have heroes in our lives. I guess tonight we're going to explore that a little bit deeper.
Absolutely.
And what a real hero does, how a real hero acts. And one of the questions that's come up, both in the chat, you guys raised this last night, and in our discussions in the Q&A, was what kind of God is this that we're talking about? Is this, the God who throws down thunderbolt and lightning and smites people? Or is this a different kind of God? Because you often hear people explaining their picture of God, and they're like, man, I don't want to serve that God. And honestly, when I hear that description, I don't want to serve that God either. I don't think any person would who is sane and reasonably thinking. So what we're going to explore today and tonight in this session is what's God really looks like. Because in the Christian heritage, the scriptures, the Bible talks about this person called Jesus, and no historian doubts the reality of a person called Jesus in the Middle East around 2030 AD. That's given. It's more the question of who was this person, and the Bible makes some pretty big claims about Jesus, that he rose from the dead, and that he's the only way to God. And so if these are the things which actually took place, then I guess that warrants some thought and some consideration. If they didn't, well, then we can throw Christianity and faith out the window. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to explore those two key questions. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And second question is Jesus the only way to God? So once again, I want to encourage your interaction in the chat. Danny, good to have you with us, and Janelle as well. As we go through, feel free to add your comments or your questions, and we will look at them as we go through the Q&A. So at this point, I want to hand over to Sven. Nathan and I are going to jump out for a little bit, and we're going to leave you in Sven's capable hands as we explore this idea of did Jesus rise from the dead?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fraser and Nathan. And this is the question, I guess, is really getting to the heart of Christianity. And we just want to explore it because it's a very important one. The reality is that down through history, there's been significant events which have changed the course of history. So first of all, we have this event in 1914. Archduke Francis Ferdinand was taking a drive in his car, and he was shot, and his wife as well, leaving 3 orphans. And as you know, that shot led to World War I, where millions of people from Australia and indeed New Zealand and many other parts of the world were killed. Very, very brutal war. Then we have another event, just a number of decades later, not too far. This was Pearl Harbor, with the Japanese Air Force coming in to bomb what was then the United States, which wasn't part of the war at that point, which led them into the war, changed the course of history as well. And more closer to our lives, about 19 years ago, roughly, there was this event with planes flying into the World Trade Center. Now, I know that some of you might be teenagers, you may not remember this event, but for those of you like myself who were alive at that time, I bet, I'm sure, that you remember exactly where you were when you found out about that event. I was, certainly. Another event that changed the course of history was this event. Perhaps you don't remember it, you probably don't, but this was my wedding. You can see I was into the Harry Potter glasses at that time, and but it was an event that changed my life. So not only can it be world events, but it can change our individual lives as well. And not only did it change my life, and now I'm really grateful for an amazing marriage, something not to be taken for granted, I know for sure. But it did change the life of possibly 2 other people who were there. And you can see my wife and I there, but you might be able to recognize the man on the left. He might look a bit familiar, a bit like our host, but a bit older. So maybe he's here tonight with us as well. But that's the amazing thing, is that, you know, there's events which when we understand the significance, when we realize what the difference it's made in our lives, it really has changed our lives. And I want to talk about one event which has changed history, and that is about 2,000 years ago, just just under 2,000 years ago, in 31 AD, this man called Jesus was crucified on a Roman cross, and he died a criminal's death. But the amazing report which we find in the Bible is that even though he was killed, even though he was executed by the strongest empire that had been around for centuries, a few days later, he rose back to life. That was the report which was being spread in Jerusalem at that time. Amazing event. And I can tell you personally that this event has changed my life. And indeed, not only my life, it's changed Nathan's life and Fraser's life. And it has changed the lives of millions of people around the world. It has that much significance, that much power, if we could put it that way. But the big question we need to ask is this: not only do we have these reports, the significance of the event, but did the event actually occur? And that's what skeptics and atheists want to know. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Well, I guess the first point that we want to make is this, is that this event, like all of the others, think of Archduke Ferdinand's assassination, think of the World Trade Center, think of my marriage as well, my wedding, I should say. These didn't just happen in a vacuum. There was a significant series of events and communication and ideas which actually led to those events which changed history. And so I want to go back in history, back from 31 AD, decades, hundreds of years, and even millennia, to find out what led to this event. And it takes us all the way back from this empty tomb with the sun rising for so many people. It takes us back all the way to King David. King David was one of the most well-regarded, well-loved Jewish kings. Lived around 1000 BC, according to Jewish records, historical records. But King David actually wrote a number of the documents in the scriptures, in particular, a number of the songs which we find in the book of Psalms. And David was a great musician. He still loved singing with the sheep when he was a shepherd. But he started to write these songs down. And in particular, what we see with these Psalms is that he had effectively these spiritual insights, what we could call visions of events which were way beyond anything that he had experienced, but pointed down into the future. So this is what he writes in Psalm 22. All who see me mock me, they make mouths at me, they wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord, let him deliver him. Let the Lord rescue him, for he delights in him. And then he goes on, for dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They've pierced my hands and feet, that I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Now we know from the Jewish historical records that David never experienced anything like this. His hands and feet were never pierced, but he was having a spiritual experience, a spiritual vision of someone else who experienced this reality. And then he goes on in Psalm 16, another of the songs that he wrote, therefore my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, that's the grave, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life, and in your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. He was saying this person that he was seeing in his vision was not going to experience corruption in the grave. Incredible message. Then we move on another 300 years according to Jewish records, and we arrive at the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 53. And if you listen as I read this, you may be thinking, that sounds familiar, because it is. It's in the oratorio, the Messiah by Handel. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. We've turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It points to a person that takes the mistakes, the wrongdoing of what people in the world have done, and this person carries that weight. But then it goes on. That says they made his grave with the wicked and with a rich man in his death, although he'd done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. But then it goes on to say, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, he shall prolong his days, the will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. So he was pierced, he was put in the grave. But Isaiah points to the fact, the prediction that he would actually see the result of what he had done and be able to rejoice in that. And then we go to the prophet Daniel, just another couple of centuries effectively later. And Daniel was praying, and he had this insight, this direct message from God. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And the streets shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome time. And after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city. And just bring that down a little bit so you can see it. Who's to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood, until the end of war desolations are determined. And then we move on to the next part of it. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. So what it's saying is that in between the rebuilding of Jerusalem, 457 BC was when that decree went out, until Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, that the Messiah would come within that time period, with a very specific time period. It's incredible to think about. But not only do we have all of those predictions which stretch back hundreds of years, we also, when we come to the life of Jesus himself, we find that he consistently would tell his followers, his disciples, that he was going to Jerusalem to be killed, but also to be raised back to life. This is what he said in Mark 10, the earliest gospel, the earliest biography we have of Jesus. And it says, and as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside. And on the way, he said to them, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And he will be raised on the third day. So there was the arrest, the false conviction, the execution by crucifixion, but also the being raised on the third day. Jesus was predicting this as well. Incredible. Once we go to a person whose life was completely changed by this event, we come to the person of Paul, who was previously Saul. And when he changed from becoming a very zealous Jewish Pharisee to becoming a follower of Jesus, this is what he told the Corinthian church. He said, for I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. Now that's very important, you notice. It said, in the past, I delivered to you something very important, but before that, I actually received it. So not only was he writing a letter, but he was reminding them of what he had shared with them, and also what he had received as well. And this is what he said, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. This is the central event: death, burial, and resurrection. And what we find is, when we go to history, we see that the resurrection event occurred in 31 AD. If we go back to the historical records, in particular with Luke. But we find that this particular teaching, this Christian teaching, if we date it according to Paul's missionary journeys and his writing of those letters, we find that the dating of this teaching can be traced back to 36 AD, which is incredibly early. It's only about 5 to 10 years after Jesus was crucified and was buried and also raised back. So we have a very, very early account of this event. Now, what I want to do now is to actually look at some historical facts which are agreed by scholars around the world who have studied the history of this event. Number one, scholars will recognize that the records, the accounts, the reports of Jesus' burial in Joseph's tomb is authentic. And why do they say that? Because there's multiple sources. You have Paul's writings, you have Mark, the earliest gospel, you have Luke, very thorough researcher into the life of Jesus. They all confirm this. And not only is it a historic event, but also you see the person who buried Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea, effectively a Jewish senator or MP, however you want to look at it. So this is a historical fact that Jesus was buried in this rich, very important person's tomb. The second fact is this, is that on the Sunday morning after the crucifixion and burial of Jesus, a group of women came to the empty tomb and found that Jesus' body was no longer there. Now, why is this important? It is very important because the reason is that we have women finding the empty tomb. Now, for us living here today in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, you might say, well, there's nothing particularly surprising about that. Why would I bring that up? Well, the challenge is, if we go back in history, like many of our cultures, the Jewish culture was a patriarchal culture. It was a male headship, male leadership in the culture. And so they didn't trust the reports of women at that time. In fact, if you went to court and you wanted to convict a family member or criminal or whatever, you could have one male witness, but you needed two female witnesses because they reckoned that they were emotional and unreliable. Now, I don't believe that. For one moment, I have a background in Sweden and New Zealand, which gave the vote to women early. But that was the reality back then. So if the disciples were making up this story, they would not have women discovering the empty tomb. They would have Peter or James or John, the significant leaders at that time. So the discovery of the empty tomb by women is powerful evidence for the authenticity of this discovery. Not only that, we also find that there was many appearances of Jesus to multiple disciples in multiple places, multiple times. And this is recognized and documented in many different sources that are very, very early as well. So we need to account for that fact too. And then finally, we come to the reality that disciples publicly proclaimed, publicly taught this message right in Jerusalem, right where Jesus had done his ministry and was also crucified and executed and buried as well. Very, very difficult place to try and start a rumor, a myth, or a legend. They did it right back in Jerusalem, and that message went right throughout the Mediterranean. That's historically verified by extra biblical sources as well. Now, the thing is this all points back to this reality that Jesus rose back to life. Now, we could ask the question, are there any other explanations which would lead us to this fact? Well, first of all, let me go through some of the main ones we could say. Number one is the conspiracy theory. The disciples stole the body of Jesus and faked his resurrection. This is the earliest alternative explanation. The problem with this explanation is that all of the disciples went to their deaths. They were executed because of their belief that Jesus rose back to life. Now, you might try and propagate a lie because of money or power or things like that. But when every single person who was proclaiming that, in terms of the closest disciples, went to their death, the reality is people don't die for a lie. That somebody will cave in. There's no reason to die for something that you know is not true. Second alternative explanation is the wrong tomb theory. So instead of going to Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, the women went to an empty tomb, the wrong tomb. They thought, wow, this is incredible. The body's not there, and they came back. The problem with this is that the disciples themselves were very skeptical, even though Jesus had told them that he was going to be raised back to life. And they didn't believe the women. And they could have easily gone with the Jewish leaders, gone to the correct tomb and rolled away the stone and said, there's the body of Jesus. You went to the wrong tomb. It just doesn't work. There's also another theory, which is the apparent death theory. So instead of Jesus dying on the cross, he fainted, but later was revived in the cool air in the tomb. But the problem with this is that Jesus, inside the tomb, he's been stabbed in the side, he's been crucified, he's been whipped. He has to roll away a massive stone from the inside. He then has to navigate his way through a whole guard of soldiers outside. He has to make his way through the empty streets of Jerusalem, go to the disciples, knock on the door, bleeding blood profusely, and then expect them to believe that he is the Son of God and the risen Messiah. It just doesn't work. He would have needed to have been taken to the hospital, not proclaimed as the risen Son of God. And the final one, which is, we could say one of the main ones, is the hallucination theory, that the disciples were hallucinating when they believed they saw Jesus alive again. The problem with this is hallucinations don't occur to multiple people at the same time in the same way. If we are all doing drugs, then we'll see different things. We won't see the same thing. And the other thing as well is that some of the people there were skeptics. Jesus' brother, James, didn't believe in Jesus. Paul didn't believe in Jesus. Thomas didn't believe in Jesus. And skeptics aren't susceptible to hallucinations. So this doesn't work either. And then, of course, you've got the problem with the empty tomb. The Jewish leaders could have said, you guys are hallucinating. Let me take you down to the real tomb and I'll show you the body which is lying there dead. And they couldn't. They didn't do it. So what does this mean? That every single naturalistic explanation has failed. And when you go to books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins and other books by famous atheists, one of the things they hardly ever touch is the resurrection of Jesus. Why? Because there is no satisfactory naturalistic explanation which addresses all of those historical facts. And in fact, the only explanation which does work is that he was raised back to life. Now, what is the personal significance of Jesus' resurrection? Well, let me go through this with you now. First of all, if Jesus was raised back to life after he died, it means that God exists. Only God could raise somebody back to life. Secondly, that God has revealed himself to you in the person of Jesus. Now, you may not have read the Bible yet, you may not be familiar with it, but still, God has taken the initiative to reveal himself to you in the person of Jesus. Thirdly, Jesus' identity has been authenticated by God. By raising him from the dead, God is saying, this is the person that I want you to listen to and follow as well. Fourthly, that Jesus died on the cross for you. That was his teaching, and that is true for you as well. That God loves you. He did this because he loves you. He could have just stayed there as transcendent being, but he stepped into our world. And finally, that you can have the hope and promise of eternal life by putting your trust in Jesus. Because if Jesus was raised back to life, you can have eternal life too. This life is not the end. We can have eternal life in Jesus. You know, there's a famous verse in the Bible which says this: "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." And I just want to encourage you and to present to you that that includes you. That includes you. You know, it's incredible. For Nathan and Fraser and myself, we have made a decision to follow Jesus. We've responded to that invitation. And in Romans 6, verse 4, it says, "We were buried with him through baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life." We can be raised to new life. We can be baptized and follow him. And in a beautiful letter that Paul wrote to the churches in Galatia, he said, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." And that is my personal testimony. And as we reflect together, as we discuss, as Nathan picks up this theme and looks at it from another angle, I would like to just invite you that if you sense the presence of God and the Holy Spirit that God is speaking to you now, I'd like to invite you that you could experience this new life in Jesus as well. It's a beautiful, beautiful experience. It will change your life. Returning back to you, Fraser.
Thank you, Sven. Yeah, there's some clear evidence there for some of these things, and we've had a few questions come in. So I want to thank you for posting questions, folks. Now's the time we're going to engage with you and hear your thoughts. Nathan's put up a link in the chat to basically a document by Sean McDowell looking at the fate of the apostles, and this idea that who would die for a lie. So you can look at that. Look, two questions have come in so far. One of them first from Darius and Elizabeth, asking, without discounting biblical evidence, do we have any extra biblical evidence from history outside of the Bible of the time of either the event or the belief in the resurrection?
We certainly do, and Nathan can share a number of lines of evidence there as well. I'd like to take you to Josephus and the Testimonium, and the fascinating thing is that Josephus confirms that Jesus had a brother called James, which is what we find in the Bible. He also confirms that Jesus was crucified, was convicted by Pontius Pilate as well. And within that testimony, what we find is many of the details of Jesus' life are confirmed. And indeed, it talks about the crucifixion and even refers to the resurrection as well. But Nathan, would you have any other evidence that you'd like to share as well?
Probably one of the earliest written documents that we have is the Apostles' Creed, which we don't actually have in print, as it would be, but we do have a indication that it existed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, for those of you that are not believers, give me a bit of a sec here, because 1 Corinthians 15 can be read like a newspaper that comes from a historical time. The critical scholarship generally agree that 1 Corinthians is pretty early. And in chapter 15,
yes.
the first few verses in chapter 15 suggest that Paul received a formula. I received that which was first of all given to me, that Jesus Christ was killed, rose again from the dead. He has this little, this confession formula that isn't his, but somebody else taught him this formula. Now we know pretty confidently that 1 Corinthians had to be written before AD 52, because there are some other details, including Sergius Paulus, whom we have a relief for, that we know was only in rulership for 1 year. So we know for a fact that 1 Corinthians had to have been written before AD 52. Paul was converted a number of years earlier, and he claims that he got that from somebody else. So there's a bit of debate about how far back it goes, but generally we're looking at 8 to 10 years after the resurrection. We've got something in print which is now going forward to a tradition. And the Apostolic Creed, by the way, is seen as early. There's quite a few resources out there on the Apostolic Creed, and I'd invite you to go there as a first start. But we also have other documents as well. Sven mentioned the Testimonium, perhaps not too short tonight, but we have quite a lot of evidence to suggest, even though the detractors might say, well, that was a Christian that made up the Testimonium or embellished it, we still have excellent reasons to suspect that it is historical evidence, because whether or not Josephus wrote that particular phrase, it is consistent with the rest of what he did write that we do take uncritically. So either way, we have a pretty strong series of documents, Josephus, Tacitus, Marabas, Serapion, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger. Each of these guys are within 50 years or less of the resurrection, and they're all talking about it. And I haven't even mentioned the church fathers yet. You might think they're biased, but they also write about this as well. And the question would be, where did their belief come from? Some people say that maybe the belief came from some other religion or some other deity, but N.T. Wright wrote a 1,000-page book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, and he shows that these ideas were new. They hadn't come on the scene before. The Jewish idea of the afterlife, the Greco-Roman view of the afterlife, was incompatible with this new upstart Christian religion. So where did that idea come from? And I know the Osiris and other suggestions don't fit if you look carefully at N.T. Wright's work.
And the other thing as well is that Pliny the Younger, which Nathan referred to, was actually writing a letter to his political mentor, Pliny the Elder, asking him what to do with these Christians, and because they were causing, well, he thought they were causing him a bit of trouble. And he says, they get up early on a Sunday morning and they sing to Christ as their God. And so what we have here is very, very early evidence which correlates with this concept. First of all, they were already recognizing Jesus' divinity, that he was the Son of God, but also there's why would they be doing that early on a Sunday morning? It's confirmation of an event which occurred earlier back in the life of Jesus on a Sunday morning, which can be traced back to the resurrection as well.
Yeah. Danny's raised a good question, because we all have had conversations with people who say, well, yeah, you've got your points, let me bring my points out, and let's debate this. And you bring your claims, they bring their counterclaims, and it takes a 2-second Google search to find them. Danny's raised a good question. How do you read all these arguments and counter arguments and reach some kind of conclusion?
It's a really good question. I haven't read the case against the case for Christ. I've read the case for Christ, but what I have read, and I've also witnessed or watched as well, is highly academic, shall I say, debates between Christian philosophers and also atheistic philosophers on the resurrection, the event of the resurrection of Jesus. And really the question is that we need to assess the evidence, the lines of reasoning, and then we have the freedom of choice of which conclusion do we find to be the most conclusive. Now, Richard Carrier and some others will actually try and claim that Jesus never even existed, that he was totally a mythical person. But people like Bart Ehrman actually take them to task and say, this is absolute rubbish. This is really, really crazy kind of concept. So we have to go back in history, and we have to ask ourselves, are these documents authentic? Were they written close to the time? And the interesting thing is this, is if you apply the same level of critique that you would to other documents, say, for example, about Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and people like that, what you find is that scholars will say that the abundance, the amount of evidence for the life of Jesus and indeed his burial and resurrection is just, it's actually embarrassing how much evidence we have. That's the comment they make. And so really you have to say, okay, well, there's this really high class, good quality evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Why would we accept events in the life of Alexander the Great and Hannibal and people like that with much weaker evidence, and yet we'd be skeptical for the life of Jesus and his resurrection? And scholars say that one of the only reasons is because we have a anti-supernatural bias. And we have to say, well, if God exists, then he could certainly do that. But Nathan, you might have some thoughts on that as well.
I really feel like we need another webinar just for this part of the discussion. I haven't read the case against the case for Christ, but I am fairly familiar with Robert M. Price, who evidently is the author of that book. And I mean this in the most respectful and kind way possible, but Robert M. Price would not be seen to be a mainstream historical expert on the historicity of Jesus. He actually
is really fringe, isn't he?
He really bases his arguments on the suggestion that we don't really have any evidence for the historical Jesus. And he actually, Bart Ehrman, by the way, is not a believer. In fact, he's turned away from God very publicly. He went to Wheaton College and says, I'm no longer a Christian. I don't believe in miracles. I don't believe in the resurrection. But he is probably one of the most respected scholars on the research concerning the historical Jesus. He's totally against Christianity. And he takes Robert M. Price to task and says, I'm sorry, man, that you're dreaming. I'm a historical scholar. I specialize in classical history. And these are all of the reasons that I think you're missing the boat. So, yeah, I know people like Robert Price exist and they mean well. They possibly have some interesting insights to bear. And I do encourage you to read their work, but keeping in mind that it takes more than a PhD to be a mainstream scholar. And this is one case where it might be handy to read a number of different sources to get the different flavors, and then you can make a decision for yourself as to what works best. The specifics tonight, I haven't got time, but I can recommend to you Gary Habermas probably is the world's expert on the resurrection. He was the advisor for my professor, Mike Licona. Mike Licona has done an historiographical investigation of the resurrection, and that is clinical, rock solid, point by point. Look at all the sides, look at the various different points and counterpoints, and he makes what we call a minimal facts approach. That means these are the bedrock facts that no matter what side you come from, these points are agreed. And after coming to those points, the conclusion is fairly frightening if you're an unbeliever. I'll let you read the book yourself, Mike Licona. It's The Resurrection of Jesus Christ and Historiographical Approach. It's heavy reading, but it stands up well, and I'd encourage you to look at it.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. On the topic of just how to have those discussions, tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 p.m., Nathan's going to be leading us through how to share what you believe in a respectful but solid way. And if I'd encourage you to jump along for that, because he's got a lot of experience in this area and it's real practical, hands-on stuff. What we might do, we've got two questions here. We might come back to these at the end. We'll jump into Sven, Nathan's presentation.
If I could just stall there, Sven, we go take a couple of questions. Got to get my presentation back up at
Sure.
Again, sorry.
All right, no worries. So Samuel raised a question. How do you respond to the assertion brought up by some atheists on the topic of the resurrection of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence?
It's a very good question, but the issue there is that what we're not doing correctly here with that statement is we're not applying probability calculus correctly. So the question is really, what sort of evidence would we expect if that event, that supernatural event, were to occur? And so what we need to do is we need to apply Bayes' theorem to these events. We have to apply Bayes' calculus to the resurrection, which looks at the background information. So once we look at all of the background information with regards to the probability that God exists, all of those lines of reasoning for whether God exists, then the probability, the probability calculus effectively says, when you calculate it, that the probability that Jesus was raised back to life based on his whole life. That's another thing in terms of background evidence to bring into this as well. The probability comes really much higher than that. So let me give you an example. So it's a fascinating example given by Professor Alvin Plantinga, and he says that if I was to tell you that I had an elephant in my tent, then you'd say, well, I've looked inside my tent, or you said you looked inside my tent, and you'd say, I can't see the elephant, so there's not an elephant there, which makes a lot of sense. But if I was to say to you that there are no-see-ums, is what Alvin Plantinga says, or these tiny little mites that have this most ferocious bite, and that they're inside my tent. If you just went inside and had a look, the fact is that just because you looked and you didn't see them with the naked eye, wouldn't mean to say these tiny no-see-ums, these mites, weren't there. So what that's saying is that there's as I said, with the probability calculus, what you need to do is you need to include the evidence in terms of the background evidence for that type of event occurring, if that makes sense. It's quite technical, but certainly what I would say is that quite often what we find with atheists, and maybe even some believers as well, is we have these trite kind of sayings which we just pull out, and that's often a thing which is kind of seen as rebuttal. But when you actually analyze the situation, what you'd find is that there's good reason to believe in the resurrection because of the background evidence for the existence of God.
I'd like to maybe just point out, sorry, I think I'm on there. I just want to point out too that I believe we actually do have extraordinary evidence. When someone presses me, hey Nathan, you need to provide extraordinary evidence, I say, great, are you ready? Because I've got some. And it does take a bit of time to go through it tonight, but Monica makes a comment here about the speed of the early church and its growth.
Just wait, could I come back to Nathan before we go to that?
Go ahead.
The other thing with the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence is that is posing an arbitrary bar on events, which is not correct the criterion, the conditions for that, the necessary and sufficient conditions for testing those criterion is not established. So in many ways, the challenge with that comment, it's a very hand-wavy kind of comment, just sort of to brush aside a statement or an explanation like a supernatural event without actually specifying what requirements do you need to establish to see that event could or would not occur. And that comes back to this idea of Bayesian theorem and also probability calculus. But back to you, Nathan.
I think our time's getting away, but I just wanted to make the comment perhaps that we do have some non-supernatural data points from history that we can agree on. We can, as Monica suggests, for example, agree that there was no Christianity, and then suddenly within 300 years, it is the main religion of the Roman Empire. Now, we've got to account for that in some way. I'm open to any hypothesis that you might put forward, but that's got to be one data point that we have to take into consideration. We also have 12 other facts that Gary Habermas surveyed among about 300 different scholars who are not believers, by the way, in the resurrection. But they identified 12 key points that they could all agree on as historical facts. So the obvious question is, if you're imagining you're doing a dot-to-dot drawing, I used to do that when I was a kid, I'm going to connect the dots. We have to connect 12 historical facts with the emergence of the Christian church. And I challenge you, I dare you, in fact, to give me one hypothesis that works. I'm a kind-hearted person. I'll take any hypothesis you have. I'll even take a flying spaghetti monster hypothesis, but give me one that works. Because so far, I've spent quite a bit of time on this, there are 12 possible explanations, and 11 of them only score 2 or 3 out of 6 possible criteria, and I'm using atheist criteria to evaluate the plausibility. C.B. and McCullough from La Trobe University, Melbourne. So I put it right back. I'm going to use common events, not extraordinary. I'm not going to depend on miracles, just asking for historical facts. I'm asking you to explain to me the reason, or how did it come to be that those 12 facts happen. And the best answer I've gotten so far is, well, Nathan, we just don't know. So while you don't know, let me suggest the possible resurrection hypothesis. And if you get a better idea, let me know, because I haven't heard it yet. But I'm very open.
All right, the challenge has been laid down. Join us tomorrow morning at 10:30, and you can bring your hypothesis back to Nathan if you've got one.
Yeah.
Nathan, we're going to hand over to you now, and you're going to take us through this content of, is Jesus the only way to God?
Hey, welcome everybody, and I'm just so grateful for the chance to be able to share a story with you tonight. I think you might have figured out I really enjoy stories, and it just so happens that I like aviation stories, so please indulge me here. This particular one is another true story, and it comes from South Australia, where I've spent a substantial part of my life flying aeroplanes. And this happened back in the days when this particular aeroplane was much more common than it is today. This is an Australian aeroplane, for those of you that are proud Aussies, and it's called a Wacket. Now, I'm not asking for any smart comments, but this was a trainer used by the Australians and those that came to do their flight training during World War II. And right now I'm actually employed. My aeroplane is based out of Maryborough in Queensland, and we actually have one of these that we're currently restoring. The time of year is January. We're back in the 60s, and a gentleman by the name of Jim was a very happy man. He was engaged to a beautiful young lady, and he loved her very much. He also liked to fly aeroplanes, and this photo is a representative of the kind of aeroplane that he had just purchased. It didn't have an engine. He got it quite cheap for £20, I think it was, but he was able to get an engine installed, do it up a little bit, and fly it across the country from Melbourne to Perth. And this took a few days, of course. So join me on Sunday morning. He's just spent the night in Whyalla, South Australia, which is very close to where I used to live in Port Augusta. And he did his pre-flight inspection, hopped in the aeroplane, got on the radio, and he called up something like this. Whyalla traffic. This is Bravo Echo Charlie. Wacket taxiing from the apron departure runway 17 Whyalla. The weather was good. He had fuel tanks full, and he had no idea the adventure that he was about to embark on this particular day. He took off from Whyalla, flew uneventfully along the railway line, the road, I'm sorry, towards Ceduna, and stopped in for fuel. After he got fuel, he was going to embark on the next leg of his journey to a very remote place called Cook, which is a refueling stop for the trains along the Transcontinental Railroad. And you can see there a picture of Ceduna in the bottom right-hand corner, a nice little town on the Great Australian, not quite the top of the bight, but in the Southern Ocean. And he got there for fuel, intending to follow the green line towards Cook. In the picture there, you see the white line is the train tracks. They didn't have GPS in those days. So his intention was to fly northwesterly and hit the train tracks and then follow those to Cook. Or if he did it really well, navigate straight to Cook, and he'd be able to make a landing there at that railway siding, get some fuel, maybe spend the night. Unfortunately, as he took off, he was not aware of a minor problem in his aircraft. His compass was mounted on a metal plate that had a screw loose. And because the screw was loose, this plate happened to rotate a little bit so that the compass was not quite indicating correctly. And so, totally oblivious to this piece of important information, Jim took off and flew more along the lines of the yellow arrow that you see on the screen, and ended up in a direction that he had not really intended to go. We'll come back to Jim's story. I want to just bring you a couple of extra thoughts and pictures as we look into the claim tonight. How could it be that Jesus might be claiming to be the only way to God? What kind of a person would be so arrogant as to claim that? Well, I just want to show this picture to you and have you think about it for a minute. What do you see on this flag here? What kind of message is being conveyed? I'm happy for you to pop up in the chat if you want to give me some suggestions. You might recognize some symbols, different worldviews and different faiths, different perspectives. What kind of people, what kind of message is being conveyed here, do you think? Is this a message of equality and peace and harmony? Or is this some kind of a, hey, let's all get along? Or is this perhaps saying all ideas are equal? How is this going to cash out, I wonder? I'm just kind of curious how you might see this one. We have to kind of wonder, as we look at a flag like this, what is it that needs to coexist? Is it people that need to coexist? Or is it ideas that need to coexist? Ideas are immaterial, but people, you can touch them, you can give them a hug, you can smell them, you can measure how tall they are. Ideas don't have those kind of physical dimensions or properties, but they are important nonetheless. So we're talking about ideas or people on this coexist flag. I see some comments here. Darius and Elizabeth, this flag is talking about universality. Someone else says talking about life. Okay, cool. Let's sneak forward in our slides. Now, according to the person who wrote Proverbs, there's a kind of a bold claim here. I'll let you sort of think on it a little bit. There is a way which seems right to a man or to a woman or to a child or to a person. But according to this wisdom, that end could be the way of death. It could be that we have good ideas, but maybe our good ideas aren't always necessarily the best ideas. Let's just look at this a bit more. Now, imagine you're in a conversation with somebody. Maybe a conversation might go something like this. A believer might say, well, Jesus claims to be the greatest God. And the friend might say, well, isn't that a bit arrogant? Does it seem like a bit far-fetched to say, well, my God's better than your God, or my daddy can beat your daddy at arm wrestles? I had those kind of conversations when I was a kid. What is it that makes the statement arrogant? Is just claiming that something is the best, does that make that statement arrogant? What if, for example, I were to say that the sun is the largest body in our solar system? Is that an arrogant claim? What if I told you that I was the smartest person in the universe? That might be an arrogant claim, perhaps. How do we decide an arrogant claim versus something which is less controversial? Which country has the longest coastline, for example? If I said it was New Zealand, maybe that's an arrogant claim. But what if I said that Canada had the longest coastline in the world? Is that an arrogant statement? What is it that makes something arrogant? I'd like to suggest tonight that a statement is not arrogant if indeed it can be verified and if it can be proven to be true. So if I claim that I'm really intelligent, but someone else comes along and can do something smarter than I can, then maybe my claim is a bit premature. We could say misplaced, perhaps. But if I am able to tell you that it just so happens that, let's see, the Pacific Ocean is the largest ocean in the world. Hey, if you can go out there and measure it, and if we can agree that by depth, by volume, by dimensions, it is the largest ocean in the world, people can go and check on it. It really isn't an arrogant claim. It's just a statement of fact. So I guess the question tonight is, Jesus claiming to be the only way to God, is this a claim that we can measure? Is it falsifiable? And if so, can we falsify it or can we substantiate it? So 2 criteria tonight. What are the 2 criteria for becoming the greatest? I'd suggest if you want to buy the best book ever on gardening, you need to have a book or a following of a book that says, this book is the greatest book on gardening. There needs to be a claim out there. But after that claim is made, we also need to be able to confirm this claim. This book is the best on gardening because after 30 days, your strawberries will be the largest and juiciest this side of the Mississippi, or whatever the case might be. So we need to not only have a big claim about whatever it is we care about, we need to investigate and substantiate that claim. And I'm going to suggest tonight that it could be that Jesus claims to be the only way to God may be a claim that could be worth investigating. Let's have a look a bit further. Now, back to this story for Mr. Jim. He departed Sejuna, following his compass in the northwesterly direction, but I'm really sorry to say he did not arrive at Cook. He was intending to get there. He did everything he thought he needed to do to get there. He was confident he would get there, but he never did. And over the next few days, 18 aircraft went looking for him, and they searched all over the place, and they could not find any trace of him or his aircraft. Where had he gone? What on earth had happened? It just so happens that the mystery remained for about 3 years. For 3 years, Jim had disappeared into oblivion. As the newspapers put it, he had gone on a journey to nowhere, to the never never. But by chance, it was completely coincidental. About 3 years later, there was a survey aircraft that was doing some work in the area, and they just so happened to come across a little bit of an unusual anomaly in the dirt. And I'll see if I can get a picture up here for you. This is what they saw. I don't know if you can see inside the little yellow circle there. There's a little tiny white cross in the sand. As they look closer, and this is from the air, they couldn't land, they could make out the unmistakable shape of an aircraft. Hey, what aircraft is that? Who is that? They weren't totally sure what was going on, so they decided they needed to send out a land party. And about 5 or 6 days later, a group of 4 went in a couple of jeeps there to go and investigate further. And they managed to arrive at the aircraft, and this is what they found. Here's the aircraft, fully intact, all ready to go, all lined up, ready for takeoff. And it also seems to be that on the empennage, the back of the aircraft, where the man is leaning over, there were some etchings or some scratchings in the paint where Jim had written a bit of a diary of sorts, chronicling 5 or 6 days where he was with his aircraft and just waiting to be rescued, waiting for a couple of jerry cans of fuel and waiting for some food and water. Unfortunately, it looks like after 6 days, he decided that it wasn't working out for him to wait there, so he went for a walk, and he was actually never found again. The crew that investigated or had a look at the site brought this is that panel back to town, and they had a look at this. An interesting twist of fate. The very same day, it's coincidental once again, the very same day that the aircraft was found was the very same day that Jim's fiancée got married to somebody else. She had no idea what had happened to him, and her life had had moved on. Let's have a look at the specific claims about Jesus. And I just want to have you think about this airplane, Jim and his airplane. Why did I share that story tonight? What was it that threw Jim off? And I'd like to suggest there is one specific compass heading that Jim needed to get to Cook. He was only 30 degrees off, but that 30 degrees for Jim made a world of difference. So if there is a particular fact or a particular truth that we need to work out, it'd be worth probably investigating it, because imagine if we were just a couple of degrees out on our trajectory. That wouldn't be so much fun, would it? The question might be, what are the claims about Jesus? And I'd like to maybe divide our analysis into two groups of claims tonight. We're going to try and hit not only the logic, the evidence that we might have, and I'm apologizing ahead of time, it'll be superficial because of time, and I'm going to just pick a random sampling, but in the Q&A or in subsequent chat we can pick whatever your favorite flavor is. Let's have a look at the table. First of all, the logic power claims, and Sven covered this a bit tonight in the limited time that he was given, but we have a lot of data that points to the fact that Jesus was actually the fulfillment of a messianic expectation for generations, depending upon your understanding. We could even argue possibly hundreds or thousands of years. A whole nation of people was looking for a Messiah, and they identified several Messiahs through the times, but it seems something very special and unique happened about Jesus. And the interesting thing about Jesus was he didn't end up just being another one of these messianic figures who fought a couple of battles and killed a couple of the enemy. It looks like this particular Messiah seemed to tick dozens, if not perhaps more than 100 different tick boxes as far as the place of birth and the time of birth, the nature of his ministry, the kind of work he would do, his death and the resurrection. And these manuscripts, I can show you photographs if you like in the Q&A. I can show you physical documents that have been photographed that actually predate the birth of Christ. So there's something pretty special going on there. Now, we probably haven't got a whole lot of time tonight, but in Mark chapter 2, and I recommend you write this note down, but in Mark chapter 2, there's a fairly amazing story where Jesus, according to the text, is allegedly forgiving sins. Now, I picked Mark because for a skeptical audience, if you're a non-believer, Mark is the most trusted of the four Gospels. Mark is the earliest and the least embellished for people that would sort of look at the scripture this way. And in this account, it looks like Jesus is having yet another argument or a disagreement or a misunderstanding with the religious leaders. And as they're all crowded together in this small house, the friends lower a man down through the ceiling for a bit of a special impromptu meeting with Jesus. The man on the mat is wanting to be healed of his sickness, but Jesus doesn't do it. First up, the first thing Jesus says is, hey man, your sins are forgiven. Now that might sound a bit trite to you and me today, but in those days, if you said that, that was automatic asking for the death penalty. That's kind of like going to maybe a neighborhood that isn't very safe as a minority, and then holding up your fist and saying, take me on. Jesus did that in front of all the Sanhedrin and said, essentially, take me on, I'm going to forgive this guy's sins. Now, Jesus should have been killed right then and there. And it could have happened, except that, and as these religious leaders were, according to the text, were thinking, boy, we should kill this guy, Jesus says, I bet I know what you're thinking. But I want you to know that I'm going to give evidence that I have the power to forgive sins. And what's the evidence that I'm going to give? I'm going to heal this guy. I'm going to make his leg better again. Now, if this had been a fabricated story, or if Jesus hadn't really healed the guy, then he still would have been up for the public execution right then and there. Later on, when Jesus was at trial with the Sanhedrin in front of Pilate and so forth, if Jesus had been guilty of blasphemy and had not done miraculous things, there would have been no questions asked. Jesus would have been mincemeat and killed right away. But the fact that we have records of a long trial of intrigue and misadventure is clear indication that the Sanhedrin could not get Jesus for blasphemy. They wanted to, but unfortunately, Jesus had too much authority to be gainsaid. And there's the story. I'll invite you to look at it in your own time. Mark 2, verses 1 to 12. Have a close, careful read. It might just blow your socks off. It blew mine off. Interesting thing, too, that Jesus also made the claim that he would return to the world to restore justice. Now, that's a pretty bold claim to make. You know, it's not every day that someone says, you know what, things are going bad today, but I'll be back next week, and watch out because I'm going to make the wrongs right, and I'm going to deal with the people that are doing the wrong things, and I'm going to restore those that are struggling and suffering. That's a pretty big, bold claim to make. And the other amazing thing is, after the claim was made, we then have the start of a whole religion, if you like, that started from no existence, 0 Christians, to becoming the mainstream, the largest religion of the Roman Empire just 300 years later. So we've got to figure out how on earth that would make sense if there was no reason for people to believe that. I'm sure there'll be questions in the Q&A. Happy to go for those. Now, this is a very interesting point. I want you to just bear with me. It's a little bit complicated, but it's actually pretty powerful. In ancient times, death was a big deal. And when you died, depending on your traditional culture, there were very important protocols to follow so that you would have a good afterlife, whatever your particular worldview was. The Jews had particular views about death and what to do with the body after death and how to be most well prepared for later. The Greco-Roman world also had very specific views about death. And unfortunately, a lot of these views were fairly superstitious. So when people died, they were worried about how they would be treated after death. They were worried, you know, look at the pyramids, for example, as evidence of the great lengths that the wealthy used to try and prepare themselves adequately for the afterlife. All of a sudden, you've got these upstart Christians who, according to the records we have, Suetonius or Irenaeus or some of the early church fathers, and those who are making fun of these Christians, Pliny the Younger, these Christians are suddenly willing to go to death as if it doesn't matter. I mean, in fact, Irenaeus sort of says, we despise death. We don't care. We don't give a stuff because we are going to a better place. They can do whatever they want to our bodies. They can't touch our souls. Now, this was not a Jewish mindset. This was not a Greco-Roman mindset. This was a new mindset. And somehow Jesus, in his existence or his life and teachings, his ministry, somehow he must have convinced people that death wasn't a problem anymore. And I'm kind of curious, how on earth would that happen, that Jesus was able to have that power? Now, we can look at the logic, but also, how about the personhood of Jesus? If you look at the founders of other world religions, I won't name names because it's not fair. That's not being nice. But I'd challenge you to pick one area in Jesus' life that isn't right. He behaved with honor and integrity. He was beyond reproach. He was the person who stood up for the weak and the marginalized, and he was patient. He seemed to have genuine care. So much so that even the other religions today who are not Christian unanimously agree that Jesus was a good guy. And I like to say, as a Christian, the good guys on our team, we all agree he was a good guy, but he's with us. There's the logic and power claims, but he's also a super nice guy. I don't want to be trite about that, but there's a lot to the character of Jesus that really recommends itself to us. But there's something else. I want to just finish with this point. Something else about Jesus that no other God can match. And I invite you tonight to pick your favorite God or gods or whatever pantheon you have at your disposal. And I dare you to take this point on. There is one thing that Jesus can do that no other God can do. And this is the claim. And of course, the non-believers say, well, yeah, what's that? It's just another copy of another God. And I'm saying, no, this is pretty unique. This is pretty special. My God came to look for us. My God came to save us. The claim is that my God came to seek and to save me and you, those of us who are lost. Pick any other religion you like. Pick any other worldview you like. What's your God doing to save you? I would like to encourage you to think about that as we go into the Q&A. we're going to be really inviting you to think tonight, what is it that your God can offer that Jesus hasn't already offered? Thank you so much, and over to Fraser.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. There's some challenging thoughts you brought up, and honestly, I was sitting here just absorbing what you were saying. Yeah, both you and Sven have got some great insights into all of this area. Folks, any questions you've got? Any questions you want to ask? Any questions that have been raised during that presentation that you want to clarify? Brooke made a good point in defining arrogance, belief in one's superiority over others. And I guess one of the questions I want to throw out is, when somebody asks or makes this claim that, hey, isn't Christianity arrogant to suggest Jesus is the only way? This idea that you're being exclusive, you have sole ownership over the way to eternal life. How would you first respond to somebody who makes that claim? I mean, and not in terms of what's the big picture, but what would your initial response be to someone who says that to you?
I guess for me tonight, and I appreciate your comment there, Brooke. I understand the concern about putting one in a hierarchy above somebody else. It's very uncomfortable in our society today. But I guess the point of my story tonight is, and admittedly, there's lots of room for humility. We as humans tend to lack humility. So I'm not diminishing the importance of humility, but in aviation, there's one right answer for certain questions. There is one right heading to get from Ceduna to Cook. There is 360 degrees on the compass, but only one's going to help you tonight. And if it happens to be that there is one right answer, it's not arrogance to say that that is the answer. In fact, it would be fairly selfish of me to withhold the right answer from poor Mr. Jim tonight. So it's not arrogant in terms of I'm better than you. That's where we get in trouble, I think, as Christians. We are not better. In fact, the Bible makes it clear that Jesus tends to side with the non-believer more often than not. We are no better for what we believe, but the point is that Jesus is better. Jesus is better than every other God. I'm not arrogant for saying that. I'm simply reporting to you what I've found in the evidence. If you feel my evidence is misguided, I welcome that, and I welcome some evidence to the contrary. And Jesus says the same thing. He says, hey, check it out with those Pharisees in Mark chapter 2. He says, I bet you guys don't believe me, right? Well, that's fine. How about I just heal the guy, and then you decide.
And I think in answer to your question, Fraser, as well, similar to where Nathan was heading, I think one of the things to do is just say, well, why don't we check out the life of Jesus? Why don't we just read the earliest Gospels, the Gospel, the biography of Mark, and let's make our own conclusions about who Jesus was and his transforming power. I guess there's another aspect to this as well, which is, what about people who've never heard about Jesus? They might live in a remote village in China. They've never read English, Hebrew, or Greek or Latin, and that's a very important and a big question. If Jesus is the only way, where does it leave them? And that's something that we need to address as well as Christians.
Yeah, and I think these, it's not just people in, the middle of Africa who may not have heard about Jesus. I live in Melbourne, and I have had conversations with people who know nothing about the Bible. They thought Jesus was just a word that you said when you hit your thumb with a hammer. So I think it extends to, our day and age, our culture here as well.
And I think the key there is that we need to understand the bigger picture of what God is doing, that God is actually at work. Has the property of being omnipresent, as we would say philosophically. He's present everywhere, and he's actually wanting to speak to all of our hearts. So no matter whether you're Muslim or whether you're Buddhist or Jewish, the God is still working for the salvation of others. And this is the amazing thing, is that Jesus died and rose again for every person, whether you're Muslim, whether you're, have a cultural background in animism or whatever it is. He died so that you could have eternal life, and he wants to draw you through his Holy Spirit, which is another whole topic, but it's a very powerful one as well.
Monica's raised a question. How can we make Christianity attractive to people who think they don't need Jesus?
Can I put a plug for tomorrow's seminar in, Fraser? Great question, Monica. And the answer to the question is a question. And that question will be investigated tomorrow afternoon. That's a very important area. And there's some really helpful insights that I'd like to share tomorrow.
Yes, that's 2:30 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, Eastern Time, Australia. So, sorry, Monica, you're going to have to sit on the edge of your seat.
And that one's not recorded, I don't think, is it either? We record these sessions, but I think that session may not have been offered for a recording tomorrow. Is that the?
It will be recorded. We'll
okay.
And I'll share the link where it'll be played. Yep. Excellent. Monica's on board.
I guess I was supposed to address the Old Testament side of things, and I'm remiss for not covering that tonight in my presentation. I guess for people of other countries or people in the Old Testament, the question would be, well, how do they find their way to Jesus? And I guess, I don't mean it flippantly, but I'd invite you to figure out, was there a Jesus in the Old Testament? Was there a Jesus in China? Was there a Jesus in the village where somebody couldn't read the Bible in English or Hebrew? And as you think about that question, if you get stuck, let's chat. But I think you'll find some pretty exciting stuff there about this Jesus fellow, because he seems to keep on popping up everywhere like a Where's Wally? Not that I'm meaning it in a flippant way, but John chapter 6, for example. In fact, the book of John is written off by non-believers because it's a bit too out there. But if you want to read some secret sneak peek stuff, if you're an unbeliever, by the way, and want to figure out how to get us, read the book of John, because that's the enigma right there that we need to work out together. John chapter 6, John chapter 8, Jesus is making the text alleges that Jesus is making some pretty bold claims. And I guess the question would be, where did those ideas come from? What is being claimed? And what can we substantiate about those claims? Because if we can substantiate them, we've got a situation. If you can write them off, problem solved if you're a non-believer. And I encourage you, work it out. Can we write off chapter 6 of John? If you can, I'd like to know about that, because I'm still working on that one.
Yeah, excellent. Folks, any last questions? We're going to wrap up shortly. But it's been interesting to hear kind of a bit of the next step in the journey from where we were last night, exploring a little bit more about Jesus and this idea that last night God exists. We explored that, and why do we allow evil and suffering. Tonight we looked at the historical Jesus, and the fact that he himself experienced evil and suffering, and died on a cross, was buried, rose again, and explored that, and his claim that he is the only way to God. There's a lot to explore there, and if you're hearing this perhaps for the first time and you're intrigued or challenged, perhaps you're hearing this for the 2nd, 5th, 2000th time, and this is a refresher for you. We want to encourage you to take this seriously and dig into it. I want to ask Nathan if he can just share briefly. We did talk about a little bit about the reliability of Scripture, and he mentioned the scrolls. Nathan, have you got those slides to just share with us as we
up here.
get close to wrapping up?
I just want to show quickly a photograph of a piece of, it's not really paper, it's animal skin, I believe. Maybe my dad can correct me. I think it's vellum. But this is the great Isaiah scroll that is now housed in the museum in Jerusalem. It's been dated a number of different ways by mainstream scholarship who are not on board with my particular worldview. But by carbon-14 radiocarbon dating, as well as by paleographic dating, that means looking at the way the text is written, the forms and the shapes of the letters, this scroll is dated no later than about 100 BC, between about 300 to 100 BC, depending upon the methods and dates. So I think the radiocarbon dating is about 150 to 110 BC or something like that. And this red circle here on the top of the screen is a particular part I want to have a look at just quickly, and then I'll let you go. This is a close-up of that section, and there's some Hebrew converting the text. And this is from Isaiah chapter 7 from memory. And it's basically God is frustrated with the people of Israel. Keeping in mind this piece of paper predates Christ. God is frustrated with the house of David because they're not paying attention to him. And because of this frustration, imagine God getting frustrated, God says, I'm going to do something to show you my frustration and to show you that I'm serious. What's that, you might wonder? Well, I'm glad you asked. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman has conceived and is bearing a son. His name will be Emmanuel, i.e. God with us. There's the text right there. You can see there's a bit that's kind of fallen off on the left-hand side there because it's gotten damaged. We saw that in the picture earlier. I'll just zoom out so you can see that again. Maybe. There you go. See the damage at the bottom of the scroll there. We could have a whole bunch of fun looking. I've looked at about 7 different passages on the scroll, but the fact of the matter is there's no debate that this piece of paper predates Christ. The stuff on the scroll is explosive. It is essentially the book of Isaiah that we have today, and we have concrete evidence. This ink was dry on this piece of paper before Jesus was born, and I'd love to know how you deal with that, and what you do with it, and what you do with the claims inside that particular piece of not really paper, but what was paper in those days.
Yeah, so I would like to, as a team, we would love to be able to give you an opportunity to explore more about what we've been saying. In many ways, as you've heard what Nathan was saying, and myself, we've really just had the opportunity to touch on the surface. There's so many more things to share. And what we just want to share with you tonight is this, is that if you have kind of sensed that there's something inside your mind or your heart, as we might say, that's kind of drawing you to learn more, to grow more, to understand more, we would like to give you that opportunity. And so I'm just going to put the URL there. You got it a couple of times there, which is great. And if you're saying, hey, this is incredible, this we would like to dive deeper into these ideas, I'd like to invite you to either click on the link there or to take out your smartphone and just type it into your browser and just share with us, because in many ways this is kind of like a appetizer, if I could put it that way, just to explore it. And certainly from Fraser's perspective, from Nathan's perspective, and myself, we have not only explored the ideas behind the existence of God and whether Jesus rose from the dead, but also we have explored existentially. We've looked at the experience of what it's like to get to know to God. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to invite you to just click on that link and just share. There's opportunities for everyone, no matter what your background, where you feel you're at in terms of these topics. But we'd like to invite you to just click on that link and just give us some feedback. and also share with us how you would like to respond to some of the ideas that we've been sharing tonight. So it's an opportunity, and we'd love to go on this journey with you. So back to you, Fraser.
Have we lost Fraser?
There we go. I'm back. I'm back.
There he is.
Yeah, guys, love to hear from you and support you as you continue to explore this. That's about it for tonight. Tomorrow morning we kick off at 10:30, and tomorrow we're taking a bit of a different tact. Tomorrow we're looking at, has science buried God? Where does God fit within the scientific realm? And then a big question that a lot of people ask is, hey, this God of the Old Testament, he seems nasty. And so Nathan's going to explore God on trial, morality in the Old Testament. So once again, two really relevant, cracking conversations to have. Hope you can join us, bring your questions, invite a friend. We will see you there. That's it from us. Have a good night. We'll catch you then.
Thank you.